Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for coming to our talk this afternoon. I'm super excited. Black women art writers and cultural journalists are impacting care. My name is Jasmin Hernandez. I identify as she, her. I'm an author writer. I'm the founder of Gallery Gurls, which is a digital space that advocates for Black and POC, Black and brown folk in the art world since 2012. I want to thank NADA New York for facilitating this conversation this afternoon. And I'm super thrilled to be in community and in conversation with three fabulous young Black and gifted women writers, art women writers. I want to thank Daria Simone Harper for being here, Isis Davis Marks, and Jasmine Weber. Very excited for this afternoon's conversation. I will quickly just read off everyone's bio, and then we'll just go from there and we'll jump into the questions. Jump into our conversation. I'll start with Daria. Daria Simone Harper is a multimedia journalist and writer based in Brooklyn, New York. She aims to amplify emerging Black and brown visual artists and to preserve the legacy of the trailblazing artists who paved the way for them. Her byline is featured in publications including ArtNet News, Artsy, Cultured Magazine, Essence ID, and W Magazine, among others. Daria also hosts The Art of It All, an art and culture podcast centered around conversations with emerging and established artists and art professionals of color. And I'm proud to admit that I've been on an episode as well,
Yes.
so I'm super honored.
Thank you.
Isis Davis Marks is a freelance writer and artist based in New York City. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Artsy, Smithsonian Magazine, Phillips Auctions, Cultured Magazine, The Columbia Journal, and elsewhere. In her writing practice, Isis focuses on covering contemporary art, and most of her written work draws from philosophical and art historical texts, to discuss issues concerning representation and contemporary visual culture. Jasmine Weber is a writer, editor, and artist based in Brooklyn. Her writing has been published in Burnaway as well as Hyperallergic, where she served as news editor from 2018 to 2022. She's a section editor for Black Star Film Festival's Scene Journal. In 2021, she was awarded the Rabkin Prize for Visual Arts Journalism. Her photography and collage work has been published in publications including Them, Gumbo Magazine, Rookie. Her artwork was presented in a 2019 exhibition hosted by Brick. In 2018, she received her BA in Ethnicity and Race Studies from Columbia University, specializing in Black cultural production with a concentration in visual arts. Wonderful. So my first question is, why do you do what you do, and what does art writing bring to your life? We can start with Daria.
Beautiful. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much, Jasmine, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting each of us to participate in this panel. I'm so excited to speak with all of you. And thank you to you all for being here. It means a lot to see your faces. So I do what I do because my entire life has been completely shaped by my love of art and creative expression. I'm very grateful to have grown up surrounded by a lot of family members who were gifted in a lot of ways in the visual arts, performing arts, musicians, and a lot of just range of talent. And I also believe really strongly and really deeply in the power of the written word and the importance of preservation, specifically as it comes to thinking about African diasporic communities. And I think the role of the storyteller is one that's incredibly important. And so it brings me a lot of joy to be able to contribute to this sort of discovery moment that people have when learning about new artists and their work, when they connect to it in some way, when it touches them, and just kind of thinking about all the connections that exist within our shared lived experiences, but also thinking about a larger societal context as well. So that's a little bit about why I do what I do. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And thank you again, Jasmine, for having us all here. And I really appreciate the ability to just, sort of talk about each of our individual practices, particularly because I do think that we are sort of living in a moment where Black art has received a certain degree of prominence within the contemporary art market, but also within museums and other cultural institutions. I think I've always considered myself a writer. I agree with Daria. I agree with the power of the written word, and I think that it's super important. And I also think that the archive is very important, and I think that, you know, placing these works and everything that's going on in the context of like a strong theoretical foundation is extremely important to me, especially because I am aware of the fact that the people who write about these things are often the ones who determine what does and does not get remembered. I also, you know, grew up around a lot of art. I grew up in New York City. I'm very lucky that my aunt was, you know, a collector and, you know, is a fiber artist in like her own right. And, you know, my grandfather took me to a lot of like cultural institutions in and around New York City. So I've always sort of been very enamored with museums and cultural institutions and gallery spaces. And I don't think I ever saw myself as having the capacity to be an artist or a writer. But I do think that a lot of things have changed in the recent past, especially with certain movements on like social media, like the Art Ho movement, and also the fact that a lot more Black artists and writers and editors have gotten positions of prominence like within museums. So I just am here to sort of bear witness to that and make sure that I think it gets talked about and written about in a way that I think is accurate and like from the voice of like a Black woman, because I often do feel that when publications don't have our voices, it really does warp the ways these things are sort of represented.
Hi, I also want to thank you for having us, of course, and to be in conversation with such amazing and talented folks. My journey into becoming an arts journalist and an arts writer was definitely very connected to my identity as an artist. And like you said, Isis, not necessarily knowing that there was space for me in these creative realms. When I first met you, Jasmine, I told you that it wasn't until my freshman year of college, when I first went to the Studio Museum, that my interest in photography and other art forms kind of opened up into my mutual interest into the study of race and ethnicity, and my own interest in sort of working through the theoretical and physical and day-to-day realities of being a Black woman. And so going to that museum after having only gone to museums like MoMA and the Met my entire life before that felt like a really life-changing moment for me in terms of realizing that the work that I can make can also be connected to these other interests that I had and my lived identity and my day-to-day experiences. And it sort of clicked for me because I had grown up in a house with the sort of like typical portraits that you see in like your Black grandmother's home, and I never really made the connection that I can bring my love for these sorts of colloquial art into my love of quote-unquote fine art, and that I can exist somewhere in the middle, or I can exist on whichever realm. And then I coupled that with my love for writing, my love for reading, and realized that this is a way for me to help myself think through these intersections of identity and creativity, but also to help other people think through them in a way that I didn't know that I had access to prior to turning like 18, 19, which to me felt late, and I wish that it was something that I would have been reading about when I was on Tumblr or on these other social media sites, which is also why it's so important to me now that the writing that I'm doing and the writing that I'm amplifying as an editor, as another part of my work, is accessible, it's readable to people who are younger, to people who don't have a formal art education, or who are thinking about it, or who are not thinking about it because they have other passions they're going to pursue. But arts journalism was a way for me to kind of welcome other folks into something that I feel so passionately about.
Fantastic. And I just want to add, I also feel like the tools are here. The tools weren't here 15 or 20 years ago. So with the internet, social media, blogging platforms, Squarespace, Wix, et cetera, you cultivate that passion, you bring longevity to your website, and for me personally, it's a pleasure and obligation to document Black and brown folk. It's a duty that I feel just has to be executed, and the tools help. Wonderful. What rest and care do you practice on yourself to sustain the exhaustion and heaviness of writing? Because we know writing is daunting.
I'm so glad you included this question.
And can exasperate you.
Thank you for including this. It's so important. I have definitely dealt with moments in time where I'm feeling the heaviness a bit more, or kind of just dealing with different aspects of burnout. And recently I have been trying to be increasingly mindful about the different practices that I'm utilizing to really make sure that I can show up for everyone that I need to show up for and that I want to show up for. So I would say maybe there's like 2 or 3 bullets. One is definitely nature, getting outside, moving around. There's not a lot that a walk through Prospect Park can't dissipate or kind of calm a little bit for me. So I've been trying to enjoy that quite a bit more as the weather is getting nicer. Also other types of movement, whether it be yoga, whether it's a class, free improvisational movement in my room in the morning, whatever I can to kind of allow energy to flow through. In a physical sense, I find can often help with unblocking mental kind of that feeling of being stuck. And so I find that helps a lot. And then also in contrast to both of those, I would say I've been focusing a lot more on stillness and finding space to meditate recently, and really trying to find a way to ground myself so that mind, body, spirit is all feeling connected and all feeling very settled, so that I can approach the work from a clear space.
Yeah, thank you for that, Daria. I definitely agree. I try to take the time and space and energy for myself when I need to. The one thing I will add on to that is that I am a freelance writer, so a lot of my livelihood is sort of predicated on whether or not I can produce a certain amount of things, so I can pay the rent, so I can buy food, so I can do certain things to support myself. So I do try to take time to myself and, block out time so that I have time to work and also rest. But I do think that it's often hard when your livelihood is dependent on every single assignment. So I do also hope that, moving forward, there will be more labor rights for, freelancers, especially because we're living at a time when places like Amazon are unionizing, and the New Yorker is having these unionization movements. And I do think that it's important for us to talk about Blackness, but it's also important for us to have intersectional conversations about that with regard to femininity and class, because I do think that the art world does tend to be very classist, and I think that we need to make sure that we have rights for freelancers and rights for artists and writers. Yeah.
Yeah, I would co-sign all of that you've both said. I think one of the biggest things for me is sleeping as well.
Yes.
I find that everyone has such a different process. I find that I'm very much a late night writer. I'll be writing at 4 a.m. when I finally get when something finally clicks, and then I will kind of feel exhausted for the rest of the week. And trying to force myself to get into better habits, recognizing that it'll help me in the long run, is really important to me. Another thing which you kind of touched on in terms of just going for a walk is definitely just leaving my house, remembering to not be sitting at my computer all day, because I think that writing can be a very isolating process, and it can be really easy to forget to see the people that you love because you're so focused on what you're creating in the moment. And reminding yourself that being in community is part of that process, especially when you're writing about the topics that we're writing about. Yeah.
I agree with all three of you. And also for me, it's the 3 R's. So it's reading, running, and relaxation. And also hydration is just so key. But just reading Black women authors, reading in general, but specifically reading Black women authors is the reset and the battery charge that I need. So, diving into Toni and Octavia Butler and Alice Walker, it's just the tools that I need to move forward. Great. What are some personal examples of softness and care that each of you bring to your writing?
I think personally a lot of it has to do with preparation and thinking about the way that I sort of approach, whether it's the artist that I'm working with or other folks that are going to be covered in a story, really spending as much time as possible in that sort of pre-reporting phase, and depending on the sensitivity of the subject that you're sort of covering, really taking the additional time to find moments of connection, moments of, or points of relation that can really be built upon and that can kind of allow room for the unexpected to happen or allow room for spontaneity. And so I think that, when you're working with artists, it takes a certain level of trust. They're trusting you to narrate and sort of share about their work and share about their process, which is often so deeply intimate, and so it does require a lot of attention to detail and really choosing to, in an open and honest and genuine way, show up and really just like put yourself on the line. So I definitely just try to, I guess I would say, approach things from as open as a place as possible to kind of facilitate a trustworthy space.
Thank you for that. I think that that's, so important to make sure that you are bearing witness to the artist's practice, but also to make sure that you are treating it with care and intentionality. Another thing I'll sort of just tack on to that is that I feel that, I do have a studio practice. I am a practicing artist, so I feel that when I write about art, I try to pay a lot of attention to the materiality of the work. I try to make sure that I am doing my due diligence to not only research the artist's practice, but pay attention to how they're applying the paint, how they're sculpting, what is their specific process. I think that because Black art is in such a position of prominence right now, people often risk essentializing certain artists' practice, right? But just acknowledging that every single individual artist is different, has a different cultural background. Being from the south of the United States might be different from being from New York, different from being from the Caribbean, making sure that Caribbean artists are also represented, people from the continent, and that I'm not just focusing on people from the diaspora who live in the United States and had certain access to opportunities and went to certain schools. That's how I try to treat my writing with care, and also acknowledging that I do come from I am writing from a very specific standpoint, so to make sure I'm talking, listening, also am reading scholarship about the work is extremely important to me, and listening to what people have to actually say.
A lot of the art writing that I've done has been journalism around different labor movements in the art world, so different unionizations at museums, and then also other tensions that have happened between museum administrations or gallery administrations and the workers. And so one of the ways that I have kind of incorporated softness into my work is learning more about how, as a journalist, to approach the folks that you're interviewing who are being marginalized with a level of care that perhaps other journalists at legacy publications might not be able to do. I think that working in the art press we're in a very unique position, and especially at the moment that we're having in the art press right now, things are changing a lot. Recognizing that giving one person a platform to share the experience that they're having does not mean that you need to give their abuser an equal platform. And that's sort of something that I've been learning as a journalist and in shaping the way that I move forward in my career, is learning how to create that balance and make sure that the folks that I am interviewing and speaking to and reporting on who have been marginalized, whether it's by their workplace or whether it's because of their identity in other aspects, that they feel cared for and that they don't feel like we're exposing them and opening them up to further abuse.
Amazing. I echo your sentiment with preparation, because research is massive for me. I'm just a hardcore, intense researcher. So, if I do a Google, if I'm profiling an artist, it's researching all of their platforms, their website, their Wikipedia, their social media pages, Vimeo, archival YouTube interviews, videos on Vimeo, asking for their pronouns, and just going above and beyond. Just research is so key. So as all three of you have mentioned, we are in a period of hypervisibility on Black art and art from the African diaspora. And historically in the art world, we've seen these cycles come and go where the interest diminishes and it retreats back to whiteness. So as young Black women actively writing, what are your views on this and what agency do you feel you have?
What a beautiful question. What a beautiful question. Admittedly, it's very frustrating to bear witness to kind of the swinging of the pendulum in a sense as it goes, but I will say that ultimately I feel a great sense of responsibility because I think that myself, the work that I'm doing, the work of my peers, including both of you, there's nothing about what we're doing that is surface level. We're thinking about working with the different artists and thinking about the work that they're doing in a way that really prioritizes sustainability and thinking about long-term trajectory, thinking about their career over time, and all different aspects of what that could look like. And I think that, we're not in this to really be following trends or kind of doing the next thing that's considered hot at the time when we're building connections based on really fostering true dialogue. As Isis mentioned previously, thinking about the archive, thinking about, who from the past are in dialogue with, and thinking about the ways that we're building on that, innovating and trying to create new processes and systems that can kind of use the foundation that we have to continue working in that way and preserving stories. I think it has been frustrating in my own personal experiences or in experiences that I've heard about from friends where, maybe their approach to work on different things and the intention is not clear, or you're feeling as though you're meant to check off a box or something like that. And it does happen. It definitely happens. And I think that's an important place where community comes into play as well. And so I really just try to navigate it as best I can, but just remain true to my personal mission that, I believe in this preservation, and it's a life's work. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, and thank you again for that question because I think it's so important. Another thing that I'll add is that I feel that I used to want to be an academic, and I think that having certain things in academic spaces is really important, and museums and cultural institutions, because those are the ones that preserve certain art forms. Like Qualisha Wood's piece just got acquired by the Met, and I think that that's really important. And also just being able to speak in certain academic institutions and have my work preserved there, I think is very important. So just maintaining, connections between certain institutions and the things that I'm doing, but also acknowledging that producing things in the here and now and producing journalistic works that will eventually be, safeguarded for the future is something that I'm focused on, because I do think that we are living at a particular cultural touchstone, not only in the art world, but we just were in the middle of a massive global pandemic that hasn't happened since 1918. There's a major conflict that's happening right now in the Ukraine, between Russia and the Ukraine. These are very important historical events that have happened, like the killing of George Floyd. I tried to couch all of my work in a specific political and historical context, and drawing those connections between art and society. I think that that's also very important because we are living in an increasingly visual world, as we've seen from the pandemic. People spend a lot more time on social media, have been engaging with social media in different ways. I also think that that's very important because social media has particularly been important for Black people and Black artists to gain visibility, and I do have a lot of problems with social media, and I don't think it's perfect, but just giving people the ability and the platform and the access when the Smithsonian's and the Yales and all of those other institutions don't want to necessarily let you in. Having different avenues is important, but also writing about those things so that the archive can have access to those things later, and synthesizing them in specific ways in a way that is researched and grounded in theory, I think is super important for me.
Yeah, I think that what you said about there being all of these different avenues that have come about because of the internet is a big part of why I do feel very hopeful that the sorts of waves of quote unquote representation that we've seen in the art world will stick because people like you have been able to create your own platform and have been able to reach a lot more people, whereas in the past, of course, artists and writers have always made their own avenues to reach audiences, but the access that we have to reaching millions and if not billions of people is unprecedented. I think I'm constantly thinking about the late 1960s and 1970s, seeing this huge boom in Black artists advocating for themselves and the museums kind of giving them a little bit of leeway and opening their doors just the littlest bit just for that rug to be pulled out from under them. Then seeing this wave of multiculturalism in the 1990s in the art world, welcoming these sorts of artists who are once again talking about racial and ethnic identity, to once again kind of see that disappear from under them. And then now we're seeing it in the late 2010s and into the 2020s, and it doesn't, to me, feel as precarious as what I've read about these past movements because of the fact that folks have been able to kind of dig their heels in and say, no, I'm here to stay, and here's my wide audience, and here's how I'm reaching folks. And so I think that's really important, and I think that I do feel hopeful because of the fact that we've kind of been able to make our own paths without having to solely rely on institutions. Yeah.
Wonderful. In the aftermath of the summer of 2020, there was a major uptick with art publications covering Black art with greater focus. How are you navigating writing opportunities and working with intentionality?
I think this is such a great question as well. I think following the summer of 2020 and kind of bearing witness to the increased attention towards Black artists or Black art at large, it's definitely shaped the way that I kind of have been able to accept and move in different directions with what I'm covering, the stories that I'm working on, and also has caused me to reflect even more deeply on the why I'm covering the artists that I am and choosing to tell the stories that I am. It's difficult to kind of decipher at times and can be an interesting process, I guess, of kind of figuring out all of the different background that comes along with an institution. And so I think it is really important as individual writers and as reporters to do our due diligence and really having a strong understanding of these different publications' track records in a sense, and kind of understanding really what is it that they're saying as it comes to these different issues, what has their stance been over time, historically, what has it looked like over the past several years, and kind of what are things that are causing that shift. Some things feel surface level at times, and others I think have more intention behind them to see deep-seated change or shifts happen at important levels in different institutions. And so it is definitely interesting to sort of navigate or discern different opportunities that arise, like I mentioned earlier, just thinking about the intention behind it, but also wanting to show up and contribute and make sure that, kind of like both of you have mentioned, make sure that these stories are told with care and that there is a certain level of attention being paid. And so, maybe even if it's something that there's not alignment directly with myself, I'll always kind of try to think about other ways or maybe other people that can help out or fill a void in a way that maybe I don't feel as compelled to. But it's an interesting navigation process for sure.
And yeah, thank you again for this question. I think it's also pretty interesting because Black publications and Black artists and Black writers have always sort of explored these issues. Like we have Essence, like we have Jet, like we have Black Art in America, we have Sugarcane Magazine. We have all of these Black publications who have really been doing the work and have been doing the work for a long time, and even thinking about the evolution of like music recently. Now we have like the Doja Cats and like the Beyoncés in the mainstream, but like, I mean, like we had Lil' Kim and like all these other people like making work before, like Foxy Brown, like all of these like really important like female MCs and like people who were doing the work like in Black nightlife and music and culture and all of that stuff. So I think this question has a lot to do about like subjectivity, right? And like who is the subject of this question? Who is paying attention to Black art? Because I feel like this has always been a thing like within our communities. And what does it mean for certain things to move into the mainstream? And again, I think that these are tied to questions of like not only class, but like of recognition. Who do we want to be recognized by and why? So I think it's great that other people are paying attention to Black art, but I also just want to give the flowers to the people who have been doing that work. But I am glad that it has moved into a larger like conversation.
Yeah, I think on a similar note, I think one thing that I am glad to see as a result of this sort of moment that we went through in 2020, although there is a lot of exploitation that should absolutely be discussed, I am glad to see a sort of shift away from this idea that every art writer can write about every piece of art. Because I think that it's really important to acknowledge the nuance that happens when someone is writing about a piece of art that is specifically about identity and they are a part of that identity. There is going to be a very different connection to the work that they can express that someone who does not have that same connection cannot. And I don't believe that only Black people should write about Black art, but I do think that it was a huge issue that Black art writers were never being commissioned to write about Black art. So I am glad to see that shift towards opening up these opportunities to Black art writers when folks used to need to like beat down the door. But at the same time, that does not mean that in any case that things are perfect now. Very far from it, but yeah.
Great, so this is actually an add-on. Themed months like Black History Month, Women's History Month, Pride Month, AAPI History Month feel very capitalist-driven, and brands and publications become overly performative during these months. How do you discern your gigs but still welcome the opportunities?
Do either of y'all want to jump on that?
Truthfully, I actually have very recently, at the beginning of this year, switched from being in an editor capacity to a freelance capacity. So this upcoming year will actually be my first time kind of experiencing this. So I don't know if I'm the best equipped to answer.
Sorry.
You can go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, it's a sort of thing where I think it's okay to have a special time to talk about, certain identity groups, especially if they don't necessarily get those flowers at every single point throughout the year. However, I think that people just need to acknowledge that this should be a consistent thing. But I think it's fine to have like a specific day to I mean, we have birthdays, right? We celebrate birthdays. It's not like every day is going to be all about me, me, me. But I think it's nice, like, for example, like, I know the two of you also did this too, but like I curated a Black History Month show for Artsy that was a virtual show. And I thought that it was nice to be able to look into Black artists who I admired and give them their flowers at that point in the month.
I love that. I also agree. I think there's definitely a way to participate or sort of take on work that does fall in these themed months, although sometimes they can feel performative or a little bit frustrating, I guess, in approach. We know that they are going to happen. We can expect them. And I think it's an opportunity to think creatively. And again, like I mentioned, that aspect of due diligence, really thinking about maybe even looking at previous examples with a publication. Is this like their second or third year even having a women's history, anything, any mention, or is it like something that has been consistently over time? There have been a range of stories that are being told to kind of represent different voices and include different stories. So I think it's definitely in discerning through that, I think it is important, and I think there is value of sort of having these specialized times where we can really look and learn in a, maybe take a deeper dive on certain topics. But I do find that, just honestly speaking, it's very unsettling when like you work with a publication and that's the only time you hear from them.
Right.
It's like you don't want to talk to me outside of Black history.
Yeah, I think just to jump in, I think that definitely, like I said, prior to this year, I had been working in more of an editorial capacity when it comes to these sorts of things, and I was actually thinking exactly that like one of the most important things as an editor when you're approaching writers is just like coming correct, and like you cannot be only reaching out to a writer if you're reaching out to an Asian American writer and you're only reaching out to them in May and they do not hear from you until next May, it's extremely disrespectful to the work that they do, and it exposes the work that you claim you're trying to do as being very shallow. And so that, I think, is like of the utmost necessity when you're trying to be respectful when organizing things during these heritage months. Yeah.
I personally believe it's just doing the work year-round, which all four of us do. And also, if you have your own platform, it's doing the work year-round on your own platform. So, for example, like I wrote about, Black women gallerists and non-binary gallerists, in March for Women's History Month. And, of course, Artie was receptive, and it was published, and it was amazing. But that's something I would pitch year-round. I would write about a Black queer artist, not just in February, but, in August or January. But at the same time, I do want to work. So when these opportunities do come during these months, I think it's just intentionality with the brand and with the publication you're working with, and where their head is at. In the art media ecosystem, more Black freelance writers are contributing to mainstream art publications, but not many of us are staff, and we're also edited by white people. How do each of you approach working with non-Black editors and copy editors, because that's also important, especially when it comes to Black cultural nuances?
To this moment, I can probably count, I was gonna say on one hand, but like probably 2 or 3 fingers, the times that I've worked with Black Black staff editors at an arts publication. It is very rare and not something that I've experienced a lot. And so there have been moments that I've experienced in writing where, maybe there's lack of information or confusion around, maybe it's a phrase or a certain word expression, like you mentioned, that is very much steeped in cultural nuance. And I find that it's really just an opportunity to assert my voice and believe and trust in the fact that, to your point, Jasmine, there are moments in time where my identity and my lived experience are just going to work for this story in a different way than maybe the editor that I'm working with, and always in a respectful way, just sort of communicating the importance of that different nuance and understanding that there's value there. I think it's also something that I go back and forth with, and it can be a bit difficult to balance, but typically if there is a situation like that, the recommendation immediately becomes to simply explain what maybe this phrase or expression is. And while I do think that's important on the one hand because of increasing the understanding or opening up and educating on certain aspects of cultural tradition, I also do believe that it's important to trust in certain moments that who that was meant to impact, it will impact them and they'll understand it. I hate to make it very like URL, but it's like the girls that get it. And
Absolutely.
and some things really exist in a very particular way, and I think that it's important to honor those spaces, honor those moments when they come up, to have conversation about it. Like I mentioned, as a writer dealing with editors and copy editors, I've definitely experienced that. Just as it comes to thinking about language and grammar and all these different things, there's so much history in the way that we speak and in African American vernacular and all of these things, and there's a lot of care that has to go into that process of really making sure to honor the importance of those different traditions. So I definitely have tried my best to, like I said, move boldly and assertively in those spaces where I do feel like maybe something is being questioned or or attempting to be erased, maybe not in a malicious way, but just for lack of understanding.
No, I definitely agree with what you said, Daria. I feel like my big issue with the fact that there aren't very many Black editors is that it will often like warp the language, and I often do think that language is inherently associated with power, and the ways in which we deliver things and communicate things via language, it can often, I think, be used particularly against Black and brown people. I think that, you know, if you don't adhere to the copy style like of a magazine or a publication, then you're often like sort of seen as like uneducated or, you know, like sort of ill-equipped to talk about the subject that you want to talk about. I think it would be great if we had more like sort of like artist-run Black publications as well, so we could hear things from the perspective of, you know, the artists in a way that is sort of like from the, you know, the source of the horse's mouth or whatever. Like if we had like a bomb with like all like Black editors, I think that that would be a really interesting project.
And actually, Jasmine, I'm going to lead into you because I have a specific question for you. So you're a former associate news editor at Hyperallergic, and it's such a rarity to work with a Black staff editor at an art publication. So what were some elements of your role that you realized were very significant?
Yeah, I think being a Black editor at a major art publication, it was just something I heard very frequently from other Black writers, was just that it's such a rarity of an experience. I've worked myself very closely with one of my colleagues at Hyperallergic, who now I work with, where she's the editor-in-chief of Scene Journal from Black Star. It's a very different experience than my experiences having worked with non-Black editors, most of whom are white. It's rare in general to work with non-white editors, especially in the arts. And so I think that I was very aware of how distinctive that position was to be a Black editor, because I would want to ensure that I was being an advocate for the writer that I was working with. I think also it reminds me of something that you were saying, Isis, just about how there are so many like cultural nuances also, where like I am the descendant of enslaved Black folks in the US, and when I work with a writer who is Black but Dominican or Black but Jamaican, there are often times when I want to make sure that I'm being sensitive and that I'm not erasing something that I might not be understanding the reference to. And so I think that being a Black writer working with non-Black editors frequently made me hyper aware of ensuring that I was never trying to like bulldoze over really important cultural context. I think also as a writer, I am never writing for a white audience, as I think some editors tend to not realize that they're editing for a white audience. And I want to make sure that if I'm writing about a Black artist and Black folks don't feel like they are the ones being spoken to, I don't feel like I've done what I wanted to do with my piece. Yeah.
Amazing. I know each of you have other disciplines. Isis, you're an artist. Daria, you're a podcaster. And Jasmine, you're a collagist, photographer, and a managing editor at Urban Books. Can each of you briefly talk about your other practices and balancing that with your art writing?
Absolutely. So as Jasmine mentioned, I also host a podcast called The Art of It All, which I was lucky enough to interview Jasmine for last year. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so the podcast it's an art and culture show. It's centered around conversations between emerging and established artists and cultural workers of color. And we dig into different aspects of their practice and also think about ways that their identity shows up in their work, other themes and societal norms and things that they're kind of digging into. And I typically choose to focus on artists who I am just really inspired by and believe that they deserve further amplification of their work. It can be a bit difficult at times to manage that alongside the freelance writing, but at the same time, they do feel like a bit of an organic growth from one another in a lot of ways. sometimes if there are artists that I'm learning about through stories that I'm working on, and maybe things don't fit just quite right to write about them at the time, there's always ways that I'm looking to kind of bring in and expand on the conversations that I can have on the show. And so bandwidth and capacity-wise, it's a lot of navigating, a lot of juggling. The podcast itself, I produce on my own and do every different aspect that it takes to put it out into the world, so that can be quite a bit of work. But I really enjoy it, and I believe that it's really important, the conversations that we're having. Part of the reason why I started the show was just because I was feeling really excited about a lot of the interviews and conversations I was having and stories that I was working on, just feeling a lot of invigoration, and I was kind of thinking, I want more people to hear this and feel that they can find different ways to sort of engage with art. Obviously, the writing is so important, but I think audio and other forms of media are really important too, to just be able to engage with as many people as possible and kind of learn more about these ideas. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, and thank you for asking us our other practices too, because I think that they can sort of, like Daria said, like inform how we write. Especially, I once had a writing teacher tell me that, like, when you're writing creatively, you shouldn't just focus on like visual aspects, but that you should focus on like things like sound and touch and feeling and things of that nature. And I feel that when it comes to my writing and when it comes to my art, I try to make sure that my practice is very embodied. So I do feel that my artistic practice feeds into my writing practice, because I often focus on textile based and painting and photography in my artistic practice, and that's often what I end up writing about. I cover a lot of textile artists, like Ambrose is a favorite who I cover, and like Sutitra Matai, I really love her work. And just having that experience like with textiles helps me to understand like what it is that the artists are trying to say, and sort of vice versa. Like when I get assignments where I'm sort of forced to do a deep dive like into learning about the histories of particular media, like it helps me to then take that and apply it to my own practice, because I do see my practice as being very conceptual and research driven. For example, I think in 2020 I wrote an article for Artsy about the history of quilt making, and that really sort of like caused me to like pivot in terms of the directions that I took like in my own artistic practice.
I will say for me, it's very hard for me to kind of focus on writing and my artwork at the same time, and that's something that I'm really trying to better learn how to meld them together. So I'm really glad to like hear that and to like see what other folks who are artists and also writers do. I find myself sometimes being in the headspace of like being an editor and a writer. I feel like intimidated by my work, because I'll start to get psyched out and I'll be like, oh, but this person I'm writing about is so good, and what's the point, because this other person is doing this work that I know that I couldn't do. And so I've been trying to get myself out of that headspace to recognize that like having the creativity to be able to work in everything that I'm interested in actually only benefits me, because it does help me connect better with other artists when I'm also very actively into my own practice, to see the parallels between our own work, to see the tensions between our work, and to see it through that lens of being an artist. It's very different. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I just have one final question. We can just answer it very briefly. What advice do you have for Black and POC folk at any stage in their life who want to write?
If you're already writing, don't stop writing. And if you haven't started, do it now, and then don't stop writing. Because we, as different folks of the African diaspora, we've dealt with so many attempts at intentional erasure of our contributions, our achievements, our legacies, our stories, and our existence, honestly. And so I think that any time that we are able to show up for one another, make space to tell our stories in whatever way or shape or form that might take, it's incredibly important. And so I think that just start and don't stop.
Amazing.
I think that if you write, you are a writer. You don't necessarily have to be paid for your work in order to be considered a writer. I think if you feel it and you do it, then that's what you are. And I don't think, you should be defined by your job. And I also think that if you're interested in doing it professionally, just, try to pitch and don't stop. Like when I first started freelancing, I had a whole spreadsheet of editors and publications that I wanted to write for, and I made it my business to try to send out 10 pitches a week. And just, keep going, tap into your networks, reach out to other writers if you find their practices interesting. And also try to think about what do you want to write about, get onto press lists. And I think it's really unfortunate that there's so much gatekeeping in, both, journalism and in the art world. But I think that what Jasmine has done is really admirable, because I feel like, she started her own platform online. Start a blog if that's what you want to do. Start a Substack. There are so many ways that you can be a writer.
I would definitely echo everything you both are saying, and I don't want to regurgitate it, so the only thing that I really have to add is that when I was first becoming interested in arts journalism, I think one of the most important things that you can also do is read other folks' arts journalism. Make sure that you're keeping up to date with what other people are writing, whether or not you're interested in hard-hitting news, or whether or not you're interested in reviews or features or anything in between, and reaching out to those folks to say, hey, I really loved this piece. I think you're right that there are so many people who will kind of put up a wall and don't want to help you out, but there are so many people that you'll reach out to and make really great connections with, and who will really be willing to put you in contact with their editor, and who will want to talk to you about things, and who, like Jasmine, will invite you to panels and will welcome you into the work that they're doing. So that's the only thing I have to add.
Wonderful. I would just add to that, I would just say find your tribe online. That's always your biggest asset. So follow the writers that you admire, follow the legacy publications you want to write for, make wish lists, and also follow indie media, follow indie black art media. So support the Sugarcane, support the culture types, support Arts Black, Jessica Lynn, Taylor Renee Aldridge, support veteran black writers like, Brian Keith Jackson. So just find your tribe online. That's been one of my biggest assets. So we're gonna wrap up. We have around 8 minutes left for Q&A. If there are any questions in the audience, we'd be happy to take them. We have about 8 minutes left, yes? Do you want to come up? Okay.
Definitely
The
one
three
of
women here. I'll come back. Yeah. I can't. It's so many people.
I'll share two who really shaped and kind of informed as I was just started getting published my writing. Is definitely Jessica Lynn and Taylor Aldridge. Just the work that they've done with Arts Black was definitely for me a eye-opener. I was always really interested in writing growing up, and also always loved art, but I didn't necessarily put two and two together that it was something that I could do to be writing about art all the time. And so that definitely, like I said, was just an eye-opener for me, learning about their work and discovering them. I was introduced to both of them through mutual friends who are also aspiring writers, and were like, you should definitely know both of these folks. And I think that they were a huge impact on my interest.
Well, I like a lot of contemporary arts writers, but I feel like I draw most of my inspiration from older people, sometimes not alive people. Susan Sontag and Adrian Piper are really big influences for me. And I, in terms of modern writing, I'm actually really influenced by television criticism. So Doreen St. Felix, who writes for The New Yorker, I really love her work. I really love Hilton Alls' work, and Jerry Saltz. I like the way he constructs sentences a lot.
I definitely have, long before I started art writing, I really appreciated the writing of Colony Little, who writes for a bunch of different art publications. Someone who I did not read their writing until more recently is Alexandra Thomas. And so, yeah, both of them I think are really great. I also find that a lot of the time, some of the best writing are from folks who have only published one or two things. And I'll be on like Bomb or I'll be on Hyperallergic and read something and I'll see they have no other bylines. And I'll be like, well, you're just a genius passing through, I guess.
Great. Yes. Hi. For me, it's more books, so I'm ideating more book ideas. I did publish We Are Here last year. It's a coffee table book about 50 black and brown influential artists and art workers in the art world. One of the subjects are here. Sueli, there you are. Sueli's actually on the cover. Wonderful. I would say I'm ideating more book ideas, so I'm thinking fiction and other ideas in other spaces.
I'm so excited for that. I'm really interested in moving into an editor role at some point in my future, but also outside of writing, as I've shared with Isis and some other friends as well, I'm really interested in curating, and I'm hoping over the next year or so to branch into a curatorial practice and be able to expand on the storytelling that I'm doing in another format and kind of think about the different spaces and how I can kind of shift some of my thinking a bit more.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm also interested in curating. I'm actually going to have a show that's opening. I'm curating a show with someone that's going to be opening in Brooklyn like next month. So that's exciting for me. But I mean, I kind of want to do everything. I mean, like I talked about Adrian Piper, but I also think about Warhol a lot. And the fact that like in New York, it used to be a lot more common for artists and writers to be dabbling in different things. So like, I kind of want to bring that back. Like, I mean, I love the idea of like starting like an interview and doing experimental films and like painting and having like a project space. Like, I don't think that there are enough like project spaces that are run by Black artists. I really love Beverly's. It's like a nightclub, like art space downtown. Like, why can't we have like Black women running things like that? So just kind of doing everything and really embodying that like sort of 1960s, 1980s like New York art nightlife culture.
Yeah, I always grew up taking art classes at like my local art studio. I grew up on Long Island, and so that's always been something that I've wanted to do, is like return back to that and create a space that's super community focused. I recently took a pottery class at Art Shack in Brooklyn, which has kind of a similar vibe. Specifically for pottery, where they're very much concerned about community ethics and things of that sort. And so something like that. I also grew up in bookstores because my dad ran bookstores that were focused on Black literature, and so that's always something that I've kind of wanted to bring into a full circle moment, is my love for literature, my love for art, and having a project space. So, well, yeah.
Great. Any more questions or? Great, yeah.
For me, if I decide to write about something, it's usually kind of just like a gut instinct. Like I'll feel a spark when I'm looking at their work or when I'm having a conversation with them, and an idea for what I want to write about will kind of come to me in the moment. I don't necessarily love when I have to when I'm having to pull something out, knowing that I have to pitch something about someone's work. Not because I don't appreciate the work, but because it really, the pieces that just instinctually come to you, I find just turn out so much better. And that's how I kind of figure out the majority of pitches that I send will be, if someone's work really emotionally moves me, physically I feel it.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying, Jasmine. Another thing is my editors give me assignments, which is probably a lazy thing. But also Instagram, I find things on Instagram, I find things online all the time. I'm constantly online. I get a lot of press releases. I look through those. I feel like seeing things in person, like if I see something in person and I really like it, then I'll try to write about it.
I can definitely echo what both of you shared. I think it is a very immediate feeling, kind of just like you see something and it hits you and you're just like, oh, I have to write about that. I have to talk to this person. I have to know more about it. And then also, as you just added, Isis, social is a huge, huge, huge tool. But it is also, I've been really grateful over the past several months as we've been able to somewhat safely, get back out and be amongst each other, because it's been really great to, one, see the work in person, but also to engage with artists. And I think, Jasmine, you were speaking a little bit about that too. It really happens a lot too based on conversation. I think sometimes just being able to open up and connect and build on whatever that initial spark is, it makes a huge difference when you can kind of chat with people in person. So that's a little bit for me.
Wonderful. So we're going to wrap up. I want to thank my three brilliant panelists for joining me, Daria, Isis, and Jasmine. Thank you for a robust conversation. Thank you for the gems that were brought to this conversation. And it was absolutely lovely. I knew it was going to be amazing.
Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Thank
And
you, everyone.
thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone, for attending.
Thank
you.
you.
Much appreciated.